This is the Storypunks podcast, a show where we talk about all the punks. So steampunk, dieselpunk, cyberpunk, and all the other punks. I'm your host, Cindy Grigg. Episode 7, I'm talking to Andrew P. Mayer, who is a steampunk author. And Andrew is so fun to talk to about different ideas surrounding what makes science fiction versus fantasy different in steampunk, and we just get into a lot of interesting things in this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. And just by way of update, I've been making some really cool connections with other podcasters in the steampunk space. So I'm so excited to share these shows with you. And that's what I'd like to leave with you for my update this week. So I have 3 for you to check out before the interview. And this first one is really near and dear to my heart because the Steampunk Dollhouse features Bluestocking, who is this amazing host. She transmits from her bunker underneath the library. In real life, she is a library student, so she's becoming a librarian. And she has so much insight and so much wonderful analysis on how works of steampunk and related genres, how they can be analyzed through the lens of current events, through politics. And she's sassy, she's fun, and super intelligent. You are absolutely going to love this, and you will absolutely love all of these shows.
This is a test of the Steampunk Dollhouse emergency broadcast system. The podcasters you are listening to, in cooperation with Library Agent Bluestocking, have developed this system to keep you informed in the event of a library incursion. This is only a test. If this has caught your attention, you are instructed to tune in to the Steampunk Dollhouse, available on iTunes and most other podcatchers, for an in-depth and detailed breakdown of steampunk literature and how it applies to the current state of affairs in America and around the world. These are the discussions that need to be had, but you definitely won't be bored. My name is Bluestocking, I'm a steampunk librarian, and I've got a microphone. I'll keep reading your rights for as long as you keep listening. This concludes this test of the Steampunk Dollhouse emergency broadcast system. Bluestocking out.
Are you a steampunk?
A Victorian goth?
A Weird West enthusiast?
A sky pirate?
Or just steam curious?
If so, then join the Texas Steampunk Connection as we review and enjoy steampunk books, movies, comics, games, films, and events all over the great state of Texas.
Come along with your hosts, Flavio, Erica, and Thax, as we enjoy steampunk adventures and share our discoveries with you.
Something, hats, corsets, boots, etiquette, pistachios, a teapot, bullocks.
Find us on Facebook and fanboytv.com or wherever you find podcasts.
Goggles, gear, something, and always mind your gauges.
Hello there, I'm Mike, steampunk author and story crafter at the Steamrollers Adventure Podcast, a steampunk actual play comedy adventure set in the universe I
And I'm Robbie, and I'm looking for some go-go juice for this tanker, mate.
Is that supposed to be Australian? Are you doing a Mad Max thing? Or
Now look, do you have the petrol or don't you?
Robbie, we're a steampunk show. You're a clockwork automaton.
Just give me the gasoline, or, gasoline.
Knock it off.
Michael, you have to hurry up and intro the Storypunks podcast before the hackers slice into the net and bring down the entire system.
Oh, no. You're listening to Storypunks with Cindy Grigg. Robbie, quick, throw up the firewall. You jerk.
It's so much fun. So go ahead, check out these shows. And for this show, the one you're listening to right now, Storypunks, if you hear anything that you'd like to reference the visual image of, just know that this is broadcast on YouTube as well. So you can reference that. Go to storypunks.world to connect to all the different versions. And without further ado, let's get into this interview with steampunk author Andrew P. Mayer. Andrew Mayer knew he wanted to be a storyteller the moment he realized that words can be used as a key to open doors to other worlds. He spent his childhood devouring every book he could get his hands on, including quite a few he wasn't supposed to, Andrew. and got his first job at the now defunct B. Dalton's bookstore when he was just 14 years old. I didn't know that was possible.
You have to ask.
6 years and many short stories later, he interned at J.P. Putnam's Sons Publishers, where he learned that writing and publishing are two very different activities. Andrew spent over 2 decades creating video games, including the endlessly popular Dogs and Cats titles, and was a designer and creative director working with numerous companies, including Sony and Cartoon Network. Andrew, it's so wonderful to have you on the show to talk about steampunk.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we'll just jump right into our number one question. This is what steampunkers like to maybe not battle, but definitely throw down some lines. Do you have an interpretation of what is and isn't steampunk? How do you define it?
So I think it's a term that, especially when I, talk to people about the books, a lot of people don't know. So I tend to describe it to people as Victorian era fantasy. Rather than, medieval era fantasy or, even colonial era fantasy. I'm not sure that's absolutely right, but that's a good place to start a conversation with people.
Sometimes it's just great to say something simple because I've had that same experience where people have no idea what I'm talking about, family and friends. What do you do again? What are you writing? And it's nice to have a good time and place to anchor it to.
Right.
And I know that you wrote this Society of Steam series that we'll be talking about, and it's in New York. So why did you choose New York? It is the Victorian era.
Right.
Why did you choose New York?
Well, I think at the time, particularly when I started writing the books, which was like around 2009, 2010, and I decided that everything had been set in London. And I'm a native New Yorker, so I knew that New York had a rich history of the period, and I thought it would be fun to do something that wasn't set in the UK, right? Also, you can sort of, there's a nice different set of problems, and, I think New Yorkers love the history of the city, so it really worked to my advantage to be able to do that. And the Brooklyn Bridge, which is where the book opens, with the unfinished Brooklyn Bridge is where the first major scene takes place. Was just so full. It just full of metaphor, full of possibility, right? It was perfect. So, and I just went from there. And luckily, while I was writing the second and third books, I ended up living in New York about half time. So I was able to go back and visit a lot of places, and a lot of that history and those structures are still there. So it's a great place to write about.
It sounds like a magical time from a writing perspective, and you were drawing from a lot of your experience. And it is interesting I love reading about American-based steampunk, and it's not always Wild West like Andrew is talking about. So sometimes steampunk has those Wild West connotations, maybe because it's a new frontier, it's punking the establishment or the known society. I don't know if that's why it usually goes to the Wild West. Did you ever go to the West in this series?
I haven't. I do have. I haven't. There's a character and a whole side story I've got that does involve the American West. I haven't really delved into it too much. It's a whole separate boatload of research. I have a portion of my shelf which is about this long right now, which is all the books that I have to get to just get my head into that time and place in New York. And so doing that again, whatever part of the right. I mean, I could, since I live in Oregon now, I have considered what would, doing some possibility of some Portland steampunk might be fun. I know Seattle was really popular, right? Sherry put her stuff, Sherry Priest put her stuff in there. So
yeah, a lot of rich history there. Will you tell us a little bit more about this series? So the Society of Steam, we've been talking around it, but for anyone who's completely new to the series, what are the themes and what made you want to write it?
Sure. So the book itself takes place in 1880s New York. It's sort of an alternate history version where there are superheroes, gentlemen adventurers, as they like to call themselves, of that period. So it's a superhero steampunk novel, but it sort of picks up where a lot of you think that, I push deep in the story, right? So there's this group of heroes called the Paragons, and they've been the sort of the Avengers of their reality for a while, at least for 20 or 30 years. And then the daughter of the leader discovers that there's a conspiracy and corruption going on inside the organization. It's really the story of her sort of discovering and breaking away and discovering her own power and powers and discovering the corruption and all that stuff that comes with adulthood and all the discovery that comes with that. And so it's her and a mechanical man named the Automaton who go on an adventure. And of course, that leads to through 3 books worth of adventure, ultimately, 3 novels worth of adventure.
So a true coming of age story. And on that note of history, did you put a lot of alternate history in the work, or is it mostly just here it's based, I've got a few events that it's tacked to, or did you completely change history?
So I took the Marvel Comics route, right? So the way and the Marvel Comics route is that like there will be their world is our world, but with superheroes. So like there will be a President Obama or President Trump one day in that world. So the world's time, but the events may be different or the structure may be different, but we're heading in the same direction. So, I just felt like writing a superhero story, I kind of wanted to lean on some of that, on the way that I understand superhero stories to be told.
That totally makes sense. What did you get out of writing this book? What changed for you in your life?
Well, a lot of it for me. So going back to what we were talking about before, what the definition of steampunk is, right? And I said it was Victorian era fantasy. I have a pretty good definition of the difference between science fiction and fantasy, and science. So fantasy is our relationship with sort of metaphor and imagination, and science fiction is our relationship with technology, right? It's metaphorical stories about how we deal with technology. So writing the book was really interesting because looking at the Victorians and how they dealt with their technology it was the first era where suddenly you had machines that you couldn't understand how they worked just by looking at them, right? They were too complex, right? They were these, now we look at them and we think they're ridiculously simple, but at the time they just seemed, terrifying and strange, right? And so I think one of the reasons that steampunk came rolling in the way it did is because, we all have these magical little glass boxes in our pockets that we couldn't possibly understand the internal workings of. So looking at everything through that lens, this, time of incredible change, of technology rolling in, of the world seeming suddenly smaller, all of those metaphors. It was really interesting for me to realize we sort of still live in the world that the Victorians started, right? For better or for worse, right? For all the good, all the imperialism, all the discovery, all the other things, we still live in the world that they put together. So it was interesting sort of walking around and looking at, it put me into a mindset of walking around and realizing like, oh, this is the world that's still the echoes of what happened, 150 years ago.
Makes sense. And when we are talking about steampunk, I really like that you brought up, is it science fiction or is it fantasy? Mm-hmm. And I liked your definitions. I know that some people feel that it's just a matter of, all fantasy is science fiction once you really drill down into the mechanics. And then some people may, reverse that. And do you find that a lot of people disagree about those definitions, or what have you come across in your author communities? What is the scope of that within the steampunk community?
So I would say, there's a lot of disagreement, but when I throw down my definition, at least I get some like nods and like, oh, that makes sense, right? It's like, because like I said, it's, they're not really stories of the future, right? We don't know what's going to happen. Some of them do a better job than others. You sort of have Black Mirror. But if you look at Black Mirror, right, it's all about that tension, or anything like that. It's all about that tension with these new devices change the way that we interact with the world, that change our relationship with the world, right? And so Yeah, and fantasy is really more about that internal life, like the way we think about things, the way like taking the stuff in our imagination and making it something real. Right, the dragon's the perfect thing. It's this beast that we can't control, that's larger than us, that we have to fight. So I really, having had that definition, I really think my favorite steampunk is what I would say has come from the sci-fi angle. I think what trips people up is it's in the past, right? So it's not future technology, right? And we always want, science fiction has a very strong feeling of the future. So I think for a lot of people, it's hard to swallow that it's not fantasy since it's taking place in the past.
Yeah, almost always. When I first came to the space, that crossed my mind as well. I thought, well, sci-fi has always been in the future. So, but that's exactly why I found it fascinating as well. And I really like your definition. I think it's interesting to think about how your definition informs character and all the different mechanics of a story, if they can be called that. And because if it's coming from the fantasy point of view, well, that's a very internal kind of thing. Right. And then the sci-fi point of view, that is maybe a little more external. Is that how you would see it as well?
Yeah, it's a different kind of tension, right? So fantasy is, I'm really what you're facing is, characters in fantasy inevitably are facing their own fears, right? Manifest, right? And sci-fi tends to be more about attention, right? That sort of weird state of like unease, right? And you look at a movie like Arrival, which I think is a great sci-fi story.
So good.
Yeah. But it's that, right? It's more of a tension. It's not, I mean, there is some metaphor, right? There's, the ink and the, how we talk and how we speak. And that's a nice way to balance it. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of crossover, but, for myself, so I created this character, the Automaton, right? Which is and a lot of the book is dealing with whether or not he is sentient, whether he's truly a thinking machine, right?
Oh yeah.
And how, and I think as a writer, I don't need an authority. You can make your own decision. I don't need to give you authorial permission to believe either way. But the characters are having that argument, right? Whether is just because he can act like a man or talk like a person, and does that make him a person? Does that give him the rights of a person, right? What's really going on? And you never know what that internal life is. And that's a lot of fun, right? Dealing with that character and how he changes and what is his humanity, and what does that mean if he has it, right? And what does that mean while these other characters are also going through all of these things? Because the foundation of the story is my one fantastical element that is fortified steam, which is the thing that gives the superhero characters their superhero powers, right? It's magical steam, basically. But it's a technology, right? Who has it? How do they get it? What do you use it for, right? All those questions that come with every new technology that comes down the pike, right? So
that sounds really fascinating. And it leads into this question of building out a magic system or a technology system and world building. So one way I like to ask this question is, especially since you have a series, how did you evolve that world building throughout your series? Because we know that it's very important for steampunk, or it usually is. And so how did you take it through book 1 through book 3?
So I had a thing, I started trying to write a lot earlier. I've been writing on and off, since I was 12, and I never finished a novel for a really long time. And eventually I realized I had what I came to call RPG disease, which is that I wanted to write the manuals before I wrote the book. And the way I solved that problem for myself is I don't build the world out beyond what the story needs me to build out that world. I mean, if you look at Star Trek, for instance, which I think is the worst offender, they had a lot of, by the time you get to the next generation, they have a lot of episodes where there's a couple lines of dialogue where they have to say like, oh, well, it's not that, we have the same problem they had back in the original series, but it's different because this reason, so we can't fix it with what we fixed it with before, right? And I don't like to get in, like that's, the way I describe it is every time you do world building, you're really building a box around yourself, right? You're building Because the fact that you're putting time and attention into something means that you're going to be you want to lean on that, right? You're not going to keep, and the audience can't handle something new every 2 minutes either, right? So you're making a lot of choices as you're building. So the thing was, I didn't want to trap myself, but I wanted to add more to the pieces that I built. So in the first book, you get a really clear idea of what fortified steam can do, who the characters are, some of the base rules of the world, and then really I want to build on those elements as much as possible, right? So how does Tom work? What's the Automaton? Sorry, Tom is his, what everybody calls him. How does he work? What does that mean? And use all that stuff. Again, going back and taking stuff that I love from the comics, like if you look at the way Marvel does it, right? If you look at the history of Iron Man, for instance, right, that he keeps getting new armor and he gets upgraded, and what does that mean? And what is his power? How do his powers change? So I sort of built on it that way, because for the rest of it, I could just rely on reality. I could go back and I could look up some more history or find something interesting about the period and bring that in and sort of build out the world that way, right? And the Victorians is a really interesting era because you have them attempting to do a lot of the things that we're attempting to do, right? They still want machines that will help them do the same things that we want machines to help them do. So I can bring in their attempts or talk about, what is the equivalent of a machine gun in 1880, or what is the equivalent of the moment I always talk about is in the first book, I have one of the characters wake up with a hangover and stumbles out of his room, stumbles down to the bathroom, looks in the mirror, and then goes, then I want to have the character go to brush his teeth. But what's the equivalent of that in 1880? Did they have toothbrushes? Answer is yes, but not in America. And just doing all that research. So as I got more research in, and I was able to more easily put my head into that world and walk around, it got easier and easier to sort of build the technology and know what I was going for when I needed to answer questions. A lot of research though. And I missed that, when I used to write sci-fi short stories where it's like, well, I'll just make it up, whatever they brush their teeth with a supersonic toothbrush, or they, what they did in Farscape, right? They have a little creature that runs around your mouth and eats, keeps your teeth clean for you.
Yeah. History is fussy that way. It can be broken pretty easily and it takes a lot of vigilance. So I'm totally interested by the facts you brought up there about the toothbrushes and all those little details. And I think steampunk can be very detail oriented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not like Mary Robinette Kowal, who wrote some stuff, if you know who that is. She's very meticulous. Like, she literally had a spell checker she put every word she put like 3 Jane Austen novels into a spell checker, and then if a word didn't show up, she had to go and check the etymology of that word. And I don't do that. Like I'm happy to have soft corners, right? I want it to feel, I'm much more interested in that it feels rich and real than that I get every detail historically accurate. To the degree that I have to make a choice or pick a word, I'll look it up, but I'm not claiming I don't need to put a sticker on the book that says 100% historically perfect.
That's a choice every author gets to make. And that's what's so cool. I think it's really empowering. And yeah, I'm excited Mary's coming on the show. And I've heard about her doing that with the words from the Regency era.
And you have to make a choice, right? And how much time and how do you write the books and where you're going in. And she comes at it very differently. And I think you find the audience for the work that you're doing, right? You find the people who resonate with that. Looking at writing another book in the series, and it's been a little while since I finished the last one because I went off and did another series, self-published series that was just hardcore fantasy. It's a whole other discussion. But now looking at getting back into that world, I mean, it's definitely going to take time. There's a book I put out, a short story that I wrote right after, like a prequel story, a Christmas story. And like that was just easy at the time because I had it all in my head, right? So it's really building up your ability, for me anyway, just building up my ability to be in that world and tell that story.
Oh yeah. And you really do start to lose it. So I understand. With the I know I'm riffing a little bit here, so we can always cut this question out, but you were talking about automatons, and sometimes when I talk to non-steampunkers or new steampunkers, they have asked me about what automatons are. How do they differ from robots? Do you have a take on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, robots. So robot was a term that came around in the early 1900s. It's actually Tobor backwards, which was the got up. And then the first story was, man, I don't even remember all the history. Rossum's Universal Robots was the first story to use it, and I believe Tobor was a writer who talked about what those machines were. So automatons basically are different from robots in the sense that they're not independent, right? They're just machines that you crank up and then they do their thing. They're more like music boxes, right? But there wasn't really a term in the period that separates it from that. So, and it's a lovely sounding word, right?
It is, yeah.
So you know, the difference is, yeah, they did amazing things and simulated amazing things, but they only really did one action over and over and over again, right? And some of them play instruments, some of them could sew. You know, they have ones that do amazing things, even from way back before then, even from like the 1600s. There are some still around that you know. I mean, it's all about creating these little mechanical. You know, doing everything, simulating action through mechanical means, right?
Well, I'm really impressed. For those listening or watching, I went off script with that question. And you heard Andrew, he had the historical status.
A little bit. Somebody will catch me being off on something there, but yeah, it's good to know where it comes from, right? And no, and I want to take. I mean, there's another. We'll see when I get to it, but there's another trilogy that I'd like to do around it that actually pushes the whole. So I have another book I want to do that takes place around the same time period as the first, and then I have another series in mind that would push the whole thing towards the early 1900s.
And will this be in the same world, or so? Are you working towards book 4, or will it be a whole new series?
So book 4, yeah. I mean, I'm done with the trilogy. I think with Sarah's story once I got what I wanted to do there, but there's a character in particular, one of the villains that I want to tell a story about, and I think I'd like to do that as a single volume, and then sort of a side story or an alternate character, and then we'll see. If I have to write it, and then people have to like it, and then I'll make a decision. But then I wanted to pick up the story of what I'd say would be the main line in the 1915 World War I period.
Very cool. I love that time period. And just based on what you've just explained, I'm pretty sure I can guess at your response to this next question, but please let us know what you think the state of steampunk is. Some people say the time has passed. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's true?
I mean, steampunk is so weird, right? So, I first heard about it in the late 80s, and it sort of showed up as a term, and then, K.W. Jeter was the first person to write about it, to use the term, as far as people know. So it just keeps coming back around again. I mean, I think one thing that's different now is we have a lot more, it sort of opened up this ability to hack in any time period. So whether, the Victorian era, that sort of explosion of particularly Victorian era fiction, I don't know. And driven, from England and the US. Yeah, I don't know if that's going to have a resurgence the way that it did, but that opening up of fantasy and sci-fi to different periods and different genre and different technologies, I don't think that's slowed down at all. Right. But we'll see. I mean, I do think, I still see, steampunk also was weird in that it wasn't primarily a literary genre last time, right? A lot of people are in it for the tech and for the clothing. Sorry, I'm bringing tech and the clothing, and that's still going, right? That sort of maker culture that sort of wandered around it. So it's diffused a little bit, but I don't think it's dead. I mean, and I think for now, at least, that we're still, as long as we still have connections to that period of history, which I think we still do. I mean, I think we're, especially the Gilded Age and a lot of that other stuff. I think people will find those stories interesting. It's not, but as a wave, I don't know if we get another wave. I don't know if that happens again. But again, it's been going on and off for, almost 30 years now. So I can't imagine it won't find its feet again and do what it does.
Yeah. And would you say that the world needs steampunk?
Wow. The world needs steampunk. I don't know if it needs, I don't know if it needs any genre. I mean, it's, at the end of the day, this is entertainment for people, and it has power, and it has, again, the metaphor can be very powerful. If it all disappeared tomorrow, I don't know if anybody would. I mean, there'd be some sadness and some longing, but I don't think it would change people's lives in that way. I mean, but is that true for any genre? I don't know. I mean, does the world need superhero movies? Or superhero stuff? We're certainly getting a lot of it right now. So I don't know. I don't know if people need it. I'm glad that they like it. I'm glad that they enjoy it, and I'm glad that it speaks to them, right? And expands their lives in some way.
I can totally understand that. I feel like from talking with you, Andrew, it's really fun to think about the possibilities of steampunk, and it is a bit of a moving target. So I know that sometimes I hear this a lot on panels and stuff, how we just haven't had that one big steampunk work, right? That we can point to, like, oh yeah, it's like the Star Wars, or,
We haven't had a movie, right?
Yeah.
And which is what it would take, and there was a lot of stuff. I don't know if that sort of nostalgic rework is gonna. I mean, I feel like if we were gonna have it, we would have had it by now, right? I mean, there was a couple of things that were running through. There was even a little bit of interest for my stuff. We'll see. I mean, what I'd want to see is like a Netflix series or something. I mean, the other problem is people end up just sort of doing history with a little alternate, or they, pump up, like you see stuff like Peaky Blinders, which I know is later, or, we have stuff, or the Sherlock Holmes movies, right, that came out a while back, that they can just sort of steal that element or two of steampunk to sort of gin up the history a little bit and make it more visual. And I don't know if we get much more than that. I don't know if we get steampunk as a hardcore genre the way that we might, and look, even fantasy has a hard time, right? You have Lord of the Rings, and then, I mean, the cycle is pretty similar, right? You have some big fantasy movie, and then inevitably it sort of travels over till it ends up at Sword and Sandals, sort of like a 300 kind of thing. Yeah. Or, what was it? Clash of the Titans, both times, right? Both in the 70s and in the early 2000s. And then everybody's kind of like, yeah, right, I've seen enough giant scorpions. And it kind of dips down for a while. And then eventually it's like, hey, what about medieval fantasy? What about Lord of the Rings? Right now, Amazon is like, what if we bring Lord of the Rings back again? And we go through that cycle. But I don't know if it leads to this sort of like cultural explosion of fantasy the way that and the other problem is that those cultural explosions don't happen the way they did before. It's after with the internet, it's much more segmented, right? The audience finds what it likes, becomes the audience, grows to whatever size it grows to, and then it kind of just travels along that path. It doesn't take us over the way it might have in the 80s or 90s.
Oh man, so much to think about here, Andrew. And I just really appreciate your time. I feel like I could just talk to you about this for a long time. But as we leave, are there any other punks that you're interested in? It sounds like maybe some deco and diesel punk.
Yeah. I mean, I like that. I mean, so we'll do one more big Andrew philosophical point, which is, for me, the punk thing generally, right, is really, having lived, at least having been a teenager through the end of the punk era, the big part of it to me is that DIY. If do you know what that? Yeah, the whole do-it-yourself, right? And so, to me, that's a big part of what makes any punk genre punk, right? Is the idea of it sort of empowers. Like you look at cyberpunk, which I think really started this, and technology falling into the hands of the masses, right? And so, then what happens when suddenly you have monowire and all this, sort of fantastic futuristic stuff that falls in the hands of the masses. And so if you look at steampunk, right, it's really like a lot of it is that sort of like street level technology. So yeah, I'm always interested in, I love that story. I love that sort of revolutionary story of what happens when the things held by the few fall into the hands of the many. And so it doesn't matter to me if it's cyberpunk or diesel punk or anything, right? That's the story I think that that all of the genres tell best. So I'm always on the lookout for that. I think it's great in fantasy, and it's great in I had an idea for doing one what I called funk punk, which was just taking 70s technology and doing that and see what happens, right? I think we're not quite, but almost ready for that. So yeah,
you heard it here. So Andrew P. Mayer, he has coined the term funk punk.
Funk punk for the 70s stuff. So yeah, if you use it, just remember, I had that happen to me with something else I said, where somebody was like, I think somebody else said that. And I'm like, here's me saying it in 2004. It's just But yeah, so I'm always excited to see that, and I'm always excited, especially now where where publishing itself is so wide open. So I'm always on the lookout, seeing what the next new idea is. For sure, I'm excited about it.
Oh, awesome! Thank you so much, and that really ties it together. I love hearing your consensus of punk in general, and I've just really enjoyed talking with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. Find him at andrewpmayer.com. And for next week's episode, I have something exciting to announce. It will be my first Facebook Live episode for Storypunks. So I'm super excited to be having a conversation with Jeff Mack, and he is the event organizer for the Steampunk World's Fair and many other festivals. So he is also a musician, and he's writing a steampunk cookbook. So this is going to be totally fun. Please join us at the Storypunks Facebook page. You can find that by linking through my site, or you can just search for us on Facebook. And this will be next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. So yes, please join us. And if you can't submit a question live, you can always submit a question the usual ways. And again, you can just find all that information at storypunks.world. Again, if you would like to connect with the steampunk shows I mentioned earlier in this show, just head over to my site and I will link you to each of those. And they're absolutely worth it. Each one has its own unique spin, and that's exactly what we need in this community. So definitely check those out. So Steampunk Dollhouse, Texas Steampunk Connection, and the Steamrollers Adventure Podcast. Again, it's wonderful to have you here, and please visit storypunks.world to learn more and to get involved.